As well as saying something about that work, I should like, in my father's centenary year, to tell you something about some of the other music he wrote during his very short life. Several of his early compositions were performed while he was still a student at the Royal College of Music, including his symphony in A minor and his clarinet quintet. And then, in 1898, the year after he left the college, his first great opportunity arose through the kindness of Elgar, who had been invited to write an orchestral work for the forthcoming Three Choirs Festival. On April the 17th that year, Elgar sent the following letter from Fawley, Malvern, to Herbert Brewer, the organist of Gloucester Cathedral. I have received a request from the secretary to write a short orchestral thing for the evening concert. I'm sorry I'm too busy to do so. I wish you would ask Coleridge-Taylor to do it. He still wants recognition and is far away the cleverest fellow going amongst the young men. Please don't let your committee throw away the chance of doing a good act. This resulted in Coleridge-Taylor receiving the commission. He wrote the Ballade in A minor, Opus 33, for full orchestra, and after the first performance in the Shire Hall, which he conducted himself in the following September, he received an ovation. The success of the A minor ballad was followed 2 months later by Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, which was first performed at the Royal College of Music under the direction of Stanford in November 1898. This performance caused something of a sensation, and henceforward Coleridge-Taylor's future as a composer was firmly sealed. He himself said that it was the curious names that first attracted him to Hiawatha, but I believe there was also a deeper reason. Dvorak had produced his New World Symphony a few years before, in 1893, and it is known that much of the inspiration for the symphony arose through Dvorak coming across a Czech translation of Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. My father was a champion of Dvorak and was greatly influenced by his music. It is not unreasonable to suppose, therefore, that the admiration he had for Dvorak's music and his close study of it stimulated his interest in the Hiawatha poem. When asked which part of the wedding feast he liked best, my father indicated the section towards the end, sung by the altos, accompanied by tremolo strings. So he told the strange adventures of Osseo, the magician, from the evening star descended. For sheer simplicity, this is very beautiful. I find it very moving. A year after the wedding feast, the second part of the trilogy, The Death of Minnehaha, was performed at the North Staffordshire Festival in Hanley. This contains some of the most skilful writing of all 3 parts, and is a splendid and powerful setting of the drama. Richly scored, the music illustrates Longfellow's description of the long and dreary winter, the famine and the fever, the tragedy of the dying Minnehaha, the sad figure of old Nokomis, the anguish of Hiawatha. Unforgettable is the lament Wah-Honomin, Wah-Honomin, sung first by Nokomis. The third part, Hiawatha's Departure, was now completed, and the whole trilogy was first performed by the Royal Choral Society on the 22nd of March 1900. The great finale is indeed full of inspired writing with powerful dramatic qualities. Nonetheless, some people felt it to be too long, and in future copies a cut was printed with the composer's approval. I have usually ignored this when conducting the work because I feel the character of the music within this section is in great contrast to all that precedes it. Here, in my opinion, the composer has written some of the best music. This, I feel, is the very heart of Departure. In 1903, my father produced his largest choral work, The Atonement. This contains some of the most dramatic, descriptive music perhaps ever heard in relation to the subject. Father's conception of the fury and demonstration of the crowd at the crucifixion is so realistic that it apparently offended some people. However, gone are the days when portraying the subject of Calvary and Christ's suffering on the cross is considered sacrilegious. The Atonement is a work of deep religious character treated by the composer with the utmost sincerity. It was first produced at the Three Choirs Festival in Hereford. After the second performance, my father wrote to a friend in America, "The Atonement has been much abused by a portion of the English press, but not by the leading papers such as the Times, which puts it above Gounod's Redemption. The strange thing about it is this, that it was received more enthusiastically at the Royal Albert Hall than ever Hiawatha was. I was recalled twice in the middle and 3 times at the end, and the audience nearly smashed a magnificent performance by applauding in the course of a trio towards the end, almost an unheard of thing. The choir, numbering 1,000 voices, sang it as they have never done anything before." There are, of course, various other choral works by my father which I should like to mention if time permitted, but the one I must talk about is his setting of the poem by Alfred Noyes, A Tale of Old Japan. This was written in 1911, a few months only before his death. It showed he had developed a new power of expression and of deep emotion. A Tale of Old Japan received its first performance by the London Choral Society at the Queen's Hall in December 1911. Its success was such that it followed Hiawatha very closely. In fact, Father liked A Tale of Old Japan better than Hiawatha. He said, "The beauty of the poetry and imagery held me, and I had to express it musically." I have a special affection for this work, for I remember it very distinctly from the time of its actual composition, when, as a child, I stood beside my father at the piano, listening to the music and watching him as he played. He even asked me to sing some of the vocal lines. When it came to introducing either the tenor or baritone part, he joined with me in his own voice. In this way, I learned directly from him exactly how the music should be played and sung. During his student days at the college, Father's compositions included a piano quintet, a nonette for piano, wind and strings, and the Fantasy-Stück of a string quartet. But the most important of all was the clarinet quintet in F-sharp minor. He wrote this after a concert at the college in March 1895, when Brahms's quintet had been performed. It had been suggested that no one could write for this combination of instruments without showing the influence of the famous Brahms work, so Coleridge-Taylor took on the challenge. When Stanford examined the result, he turned to my father and said, "You've done it, my boy." Delighted with his pupil's work, Stanford took the score with him on his next visit to Berlin and showed it to Joachim, who was sufficiently impressed to rehearse it with his quartet on that occasion and subsequently to arrange for its performance in Germany. The violin sonata in D minor, like the clarinet quintet, also gained distinction in an unusual manner. The manuscript had been missing for several years, when the work suddenly appeared at a concert of all British music during the First World War, given at the Steinway Hall in London. On the programme was the startling news that the sonata had won the Cobbett Prize for the best work of its kind by an English composer. The rescued manuscript was made available for publication, and the sonata toured the country with Albert Salmons and William Murdoch, who thought very highly of it. Here is a very old recording of the end of the last movement, where themes from the previous two movements are recalled. The pianist is William Murdoch, and the violinist is Arthur Catterall, who was the soloist in the first performance of the violin concerto in this country. Coleridge-Taylor wrote a considerable amount of music for the theatre. He devoted 2 years to writing the 3-act opera Thelma, only to hear that production difficulties prevented its performance. Today, the difficulties envisaged would present no problem, so in all probability a production could be considered. There is also much incidental music specially composed for the stage productions by Sir Herbert Tree at His Majesty's Theatre. He loved writing for the stage and found great inspiration in collaboration with Tree. The Christmas Overture, part of the incidental music to another of Tree's projected productions, The Forest of Wild Thyme, shows the composer's colourful use of the orchestra. Coleridge-Taylor's output of orchestral music was very considerable, quite apart from the lighter pieces such as Petite Suite de Concert. His biggest purely orchestral work was the symphonic variations on an African air, which was first performed at a Philharmonic Society concert in the Queen's Hall under the composer's direction in 1906. The music inspired by his 3 visits to America showed the influence of the change in environment and freedom from personal worries. As a result of these visits, he wrote the orchestral rhapsody From the Prairies, the rhapsodic dance Bamboula, and the violin concerto in G minor, which are characteristic of the composer at his best. Unfortunately, none of these works have been recorded. The violin concerto was Coleridge-Taylor's last major composition, and he considered that it surpassed any previous work of his. The first performance in this country took place under Sir Henry Wood, with Arthur Cattrall as soloist, at the Queen's Hall in London in 1912, shortly after the composer's death. As one commentator has written, his violin concerto represents him at the height of his powers. This is not a work for the virtuoso soloist. Rather, is the entire content shared equally between orchestra and solo violin. Again, we see his masterly use of instruments in the theme, strings scored with melodies that haunt the memory, so imbued with beauty as almost to move the listener to tears. It is a mystery that such a work should have been so ignored in the British Concert Hall. I can only echo those words and express the hope that the centenary celebrations will lead to a long overdue reappraisal of the major works of Coleridge-Taylor.
Avril Coleridge-Taylor was talking about her father's music.